Now let's take a look at just psych disorders in general. I'm going to put it under the category of understanding. We looked at defining. Now let's look at understanding psych disorders. And there are a number of perspectives that come into play when we start talking about psych disorders in general. Two of the major ones that come into play is one, the medical model, and then the second one is one that we have been talking about all along, and that is the biopsychosocial model, which is far more comprehensive and captures more of the data in terms of how disorders are actually displayed themselves. Now, under the medical model, let me divide these up. We'll put medical here. Under the medical model, essentially, a psych disorder is seen as a mental illness, and you probably have heard some of these terms, and so it's a sickness of the mind, and this mental illness then needs to be diagnosed. So we have DX. It needs on the basis of symptoms, and so we follow based on symptoms. We follow the medical model. You go into a doctor, you report the symptoms you're having. They make a diagnosis and provide whatever intervention is necessary. And so the medical model sees psych disorders as a mental illness or sickness. They are diagnosed based on symptoms and essentially then are cured through therapy. And really, this has held sway for a long, long time. As a matter of fact, it still holds sway today. I will just tell you that I have a lot of grave concerns about the medical model, applying it to mental health. Some issues, some disorders, if you will, do fall into a true sickness, something that is essentially wrong internally, physiologically, and some good examples of that is schizophrenia, and another would be mood disorders, which depression would be one of them, where we have loads of evidence and research that indicate that essentially there is a heritability factor involved in schizophrenia, so much so that it, as you would expect, runs in families. The same thing is true with mood disorders. Bipolar, which is in a mood disorder, bipolar disorder is one of those examples. As a matter of fact, societally, many laws in states today do what they call a parity diagnosis, and schizophrenia, this one and this one, both fall into that parity diagnosis. In other words, they're treated just like a medical condition is. The argument against the medical model is the issue of empowerment, really. If this is something that affects me and I have no control over it, then how can I have responsibility for it? And people that of this ilk will say, well, somebody with diabetes didn't plan to or make diabetes. Now, some of the later situations with diabetes is often lifestyle related, but at the same time, we have to ask the question then, so what are we trying to do? Somebody who has diabetes, we empower them with information and the ability to treat their own illness and manage it well, take responsibility for it, even though they didn't choose it or it wasn't a result of choices and so forth. The critics of this medical model basically argue that psych disorders may not reflect a deep internal problem, but instead a difficulty in the person's environment, in their interpretation, or in bad habits or poor social skills, which leads us then to the biopsychosocial model, which, like I mentioned to you, is far more comprehensive. It is not as stigmatizing as the medical model is. There's a lot that you will hear people say that the person is sick. It is not a matter of sick. There are different elements in somebody's functioning that are dysfunctional. They may not be distressed, but they still are dysfunctional. And essentially what we hold with this notion is that all behavior arises from the interaction of nature, genetic and physiological factors, and nurture. And essentially, one particular perspective on this is a guy by the name of William Glasser, who developed something called reality therapy. And he basically said that if mental illness is truly a sickness, then it's 100% curable. And his perspective, I'm not espousing it, but I will tell you that it has had a huge impact on how we think about psych disorders, and it really boils down in his mind to how the interpretation, the way we think about things. So the biopsychosocial model assumes that disorders are influenced by genetic predisposition, so genetics, and again, this should be old hat. You should be able to predict where I'm going next. Physiological states, physio, to inner psych states, if you will. Of course, where those arise has a lot to do with your perspective about how these actually are developed. Or another word here is dynamics. And then finally, the whole idea of social, cultural impact that is part of that. So the biopsychosocial model is one that captures all of these, which we've been pointing out all along. This little cartoon really is a perspective that a lot of people have, is that if it is a mental illness, it's a sickness, and I go to the doctor and I tell him I have a sickness and he gives me some medication and the sickness goes away, then why isn't mental health that way? And the reality is that when we are actually talking about people's mental health, we are talking about such a multifaceted problem that boiling it down to simple biology is oversimplified. And you will hear people come from a variety of perspectives on it. Some people will say, particularly in the Christian world, that it's just sin. And that's a little bit like saying the sun is shining, therefore it's warm. Of course it's sin. But at the same time, that doesn't necessarily lead us to what do I do now? How do I help somebody? If I just label it as sin, then it's just a matter of repenting and then everything improves. And that's simply not true. You can go into any recovery program in any church, and you will see that people are faithful and pursuing hard after Christ and still have their disorder. So how do we contend with that, and how do we look at that? That's something to keep in mind when we actually talk about it. It may be more a matter of having an all of the above, if you will, perspective. It just depends on your purpose and what you're going to do with each.